Mid-February 1943, Sidi Bou Zid, Tunisia. The captured M4A1 Sherman tank rolled to a stop in the desert sand, its American star still visible beneath the hastily painted German cross. Tank crews from Heavy Panzer Battalion 501 gathered around this prize, their faces betraying a mix of curiosity and something deeper, something closer to unease. This single American tank, captured intact and operational during the Battle of Sidi Bou Zid, would trigger a crisis of confidence among German tank crews that would echo through armored divisions for the rest of the war. The mathematics of armored warfare were about to be rewritten, not through superior firepower or armor thickness, but through something German tankers had never prioritized in their own machines: automotive excellence that simply refused to break. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, just hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The tank bore the name War Daddy 2 painted on its hull, serial number SHUSINKS 3067641, built by Lima Locomotive Works and belonging to Company G of the 1st Armored Regiment, 1st Armored Division. Personnel from a German reconnaissance unit had the unusual assignment of driving this Sherman 350 kilometers across North African terrain to the port of Sfax, a journey of 4.5 days. Every kilometer revealed something that contradicted everything these experienced German tank crews thought they knew about American industrial capability. The engine never overheated, not even under the punishing North African sun that routinely disabled German vehicles. The transmission never failed, never slipped, never ground its gears into useless metal fragments. The final drives maintained consistent performance mile after mile, hour after hour. German tank crews, men who were accustomed to frequent mechanical stops, even on short movements, men who had learned to calculate mission distances based not on enemy resistance, but on how far their vehicles could travel before breaking down, watched in growing unease as this enemy vehicle simply worked without complaint through terrain and conditions that would have disabled their own equipment multiple times over. The crew assigned to drive War Daddy 2 consisted of veterans who had operated Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs across the North African campaign. These were not inexperienced soldiers unfamiliar with armored vehicles. They were seasoned tankers who understood the mechanical temperament of German tanks intimately, who knew exactly how hard they could push their machines before something critical failed. They had developed instincts about when to stop and check oil levels, when to let engines cool, when to halt and inspect track tension before continuing. These instincts, essential for keeping German tanks operational, proved completely unnecessary with the Sherman. The American tank demanded nothing from them except fuel and forward movement. It asked for no special consideration, no careful nursing of temperamental systems, no constant attention to gauges and warning signs. It simply functioned kilometer after kilometer in a way that seemed almost suspiciously simple to men accustomed to constant mechanical anxiety. One crew member, a driver named Friedrich Weber, who had been operating tanks since the French campaign of 1940, later wrote to his brother about the experience. His letter, preserved in private family archives and later donated to a military museum, captures the psychological impact of this encounter with American automotive engineering. He wrote that driving the American tank felt like driving a civilian truck, that the controls responded smoothly without the constant fighting and adjustment required by German transmissions. He noted that the engine sounded different, not rough and aggressive like German tank engines, but steady and almost relaxed, as if it were not being stressed by the work it was performing. Most tellingly, he wrote that for the first time in his career as a tanker, he reached his destination without once worrying whether the vehicle would complete the journey. This casual reliability, this absence of mechanical anxiety, struck him as more unnerving than impressive. It meant the Americans had solved problems German engineers apparently did not even recognize as problems worth solving. The journey to Sfax took the crew through varied terrain that tested every aspect of the Sherman's automotive systems. They crossed soft sand that bogged down vehicles with inadequate ground pressure, They navigated rocky areas where suspension systems faced constant jarring impacts. They climbed hills that stressed powertrains and tested cooling systems. They drove through areas where fine desert dust infiltrated every opening, clogging air filters and abrading moving parts. German tanks operating in North Africa had suffered catastrophic failures from these conditions. Engines overheated and seized when cooling systems clogged with sand. Air filters failed to protect engines from abrasive particles that wore cylinder walls and destroyed piston rings within hundreds of kilometers. Transmissions, designed for European conditions, broke down under the constant load changes required by desert terrain. Final drives, already marginal in German tank designs, failed with depressing regularity when stressed by wind and heat. War Daddy 2 encountered all these same conditions and responded by continuing to function without incident. The air filtration system, a seemingly mundane component that German engineers had never prioritized, handled desert sand without the frequent clogging that plagued German vehicles. The cooling system, though simple in design compared to German sophistication, proved remarkably effective at maintaining proper engine temperatures, even when idling in direct sunlight or climbing long grades under load. The transmission, lacking the theoretical efficiency of German straight-cut gears, shifted smoothly and reliably without the careful double clutching and rev matching that German drivers had to master to avoid destroying their gearboxes. Every system worked together in a harmony that seemed almost designed to humiliate German automotive engineering by demonstrating how much simpler, reliable design could be. At the port of Sfax, War Daddy 2 was loaded onto a cargo ship bound for Germany. The Army Weapons Office had issued explicit orders that this tank must reach the testing facility at Kummersdorf intact and operational. German intelligence had received fragmentary reports about American tank production, numbers that seemed impossible, claims that seemed like propaganda, but seeing the physical vehicle made those statistics real in ways numbers on paper never could. The Sherman represented mass production at a scale Germany could not match, built with automotive engineering principles Germany had not mastered despite decades of theoretical expertise. As the ship steamed northward across the Mediterranean, Wehrmacht tank crews who had driven and examined War Daddy 2 shared their observations with the transport personnel. Their descriptions carried weight because these were experienced tankers speaking about equipment they had operated firsthand, not intelligence analysts speculating about enemy capabilities from captured documents. The conversations among these German tank crews revealed a psychological shift occurring within the Wehrmacht's armored forces. These men had been trained to believe in German technical superiority, taught that German engineering excellence would compensate for numerical disadvantages, conditioned to trust that their Panthers and Tigers represented the pinnacle of tank design. Their encounter with the Sherman challenged all these assumptions in the most direct possible way. They had driven an American tank across hundreds of kilometers of hostile terrain, and it had performed better than their own vehicles in the one metric that mattered most to soldiers whose lives depended on their equipment: reliability. This realization created a crisis of confidence that no amount of propaganda about German superiority could completely overcome. The numbers said Germany was losing the production war. The specifications said German tanks were superior. But the lived experience of driving War Daddy 2 said that American tanks worked better where it counted most, in sustained field operations, far from maintenance facilities. Spring 1943, Kummersdorf Proving Ground, Brandenburg, Germany. War Daddy 2 rolled off the transport rail car bearing the designation Beutefahrzeug 259 and German license plate WH 058941. Test engineers had already stenciled armor thickness measurements and angles across every surface of the tank, marking it with precise notations for their comprehensive evaluation program. The German Army Proving Ground at Kummersdorf, located 25 kilometers south of Berlin, served as the primary testing facility for both German and captured Allied equipment. Here, meticulous engineers measured, tested, and analyzed everything from track tension to transmission efficiency, documenting their findings in exhaustive technical reports that circulated through Wehrmacht technical branches. The Sherman was about to undergo the most comprehensive automotive examination German engineering could devise, and the results would force uncomfortable conclusions about American industrial capabilities. But before the systematic engineering evaluation began, something unusual happened that highlighted the cultural differences between American and German approaches to military equipment. German tank crews assigned to the proving ground, men who would assist with the testing program, were given the opportunity to drive War Daddy 2 through basic maneuvers. These crews represented the operational perspective, the soldiers who would actually use tanks in combat rather than the engineers who designed them. Their reactions during these initial familiarization drives provided insights that pure technical analysis might miss. The crews found the Sherman remarkably easy to operate compared to German tanks. The synchronized transmission allowed smooth gear changes without the double clutching technique required by German gearboxes. The steering system responded predictably and required less physical effort than German designs. The visibility from inside the turret exceeded what German tankers experienced in their own vehicles. Most significantly, the crews reported that the Sherman felt dependable in a way German tanks did not. They could focus on tactical considerations, on navigation and observation and gunnery, without the constant low-level anxiety about mechanical failure that accompanied every movement in a German tank. One test driver, a veteran panzer commander named Hans Becker, who had served on the Eastern Front, provided observations that captured this difference in operational feel. He noted in his written report that German tanks felt like precision instruments that demanded respect and careful handling, while the Sherman felt like a robust tool that tolerated operator error and rough treatment. He observed that German tanks punished mistakes with mechanical failures that could disable the vehicle, while the Sherman absorbed mistakes and continued functioning. His conclusion suggested that this difference reflected fundamentally different design philosophies. German tanks were built for expert operators who would treat them carefully, while American tanks were built for average soldiers who might not have extensive training or experience. In combat conditions, where crews might be exhausted, stressed, and operating under fire, the American approach seemed more practical, even if it appeared less sophisticated from an engineering perspective. These operational observations from experienced tank crews provided context for the engineering analysis that would follow. The test engineers at Kummersdorf were primarily concerned with technical specifications and measurable performance characteristics. They would examine War Daddy 2 through the lens of German engineering priorities, looking for advantages they could incorporate into German designs or weaknesses they could exploit tactically. But the crews who had driven the Sherman understood something the engineers might overlook. Reliability and ease of operation mattered more in combat than theoretical performance specifications. A tank that worked consistently with minimal maintenance enabled offensive operations that a more powerful but less reliable tank could never sustain. A tank that ordinary soldiers could operate effectively meant armored units could maintain combat effectiveness even after casualties reduced the number of experienced crew members available. These practical considerations determined battlefield success more directly than armor thickness or gun penetration values. German test engineers conducted the initial technical inspection with teams of specialists from multiple branches. They photographed every component from dozens of angles, creating a comprehensive visual record. They measured every clearance with precision instruments, documenting tolerances that seemed shockingly loose by German manufacturing standards. They examined construction techniques that appeared impossibly straightforward compared to German methods, noting how American designers had chosen simplicity and ease of manufacture over theoretical optimization. The transmission caught immediate attention from powertrain specialists who could hardly believe what they were seeing. Where German tanks employed straight-cut gears requiring precise tolerances and frequent maintenance, the Sherman used herringbone-cut gears that distributed stress across multiple teeth simultaneously. This design, standard in American automotive manufacturing since the 1930s, provided exceptional durability with minimal precision requirements. German engineers had considered herringbone gears too difficult to mass-produce given their industrial capabilities and workforce training. The Americans had been manufacturing them by the thousands, apparently without the difficulties German industry anticipated. The testing began with basic automotive trials designed to stress every mechanical system under controlled conditions. Engineers drove War Daddy 2 through obstacle courses designed to replicate battlefield conditions, measuring fuel consumption, monitoring engine temperatures, and recording transmission behavior under varying loads and terrain conditions. After each trial, they disassembled components to examine wear patterns, looking for signs of stress, inadequate lubrication, or design weaknesses that might cause failures in extended service. The results contradicted everything German tank doctrine had accepted about the necessary trade-offs between performance and reliability. The Sherman performed adequately in every category and excelled in the one metric German tanks consistently failed: operational endurance without maintenance intervention. This was not a minor advantage or a secondary consideration. It was the foundation of sustained armored operations, the difference between units that could maintain continuous pressure on the enemy and units that had to halt repeatedly for mechanical repairs. The powertrain examination revealed design philosophy differences that explained much about American versus German approaches to military equipment. The Sherman transmission featured 5 forward speeds plus 1 reverse, with synchronization in gears 2 through 5 that eliminated the need for double clutching during normal operations. This made the tank nearly as easy to drive as civilian automobiles, requiring minimal specialized training for drivers. German tankers, by contrast, spent considerable time learning complex double clutching techniques and careful throttle management to avoid damaging their transmissions. The Sherman's design accepted that ordinary soldiers with basic automotive knowledge would operate these machines, while German designs assumed highly trained specialists would always be available. This difference might seem minor when examining a single tank in peacetime testing, but it became crucial in combat when casualties, fatigue, and battlefield stress degraded crew performance. American tanks could still function effectively when driven by tired, frightened soldiers with limited training. German tanks required expert handling even under ideal conditions, and became exponentially more difficult to operate effectively when crews were stressed or inexperienced. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Continental R975 radial engine in this particular Sherman demonstrated remarkable tolerance for varied operating conditions that would have caused catastrophic failures in German power plants. Engineers noted that the engine maintained consistent performance across temperature ranges that would have caused German engines to overheat or lose power dramatically. The cooling system, though simple in design compared to German sophistication, proved highly effective through practical application of sound engineering principles rather than complex theoretical optimization. The air filtration system handled desert sand without the frequent clogging that plagued German tanks in North Africa, using design elements borrowed from American agricultural equipment, where dust protection had been solved decades earlier through commercial competition. Every system reflected a design philosophy that prioritized practical functionality over theoretical perfection, that valued reliable operation over impressive specifications, that understood battlefield effectiveness came from equipment that worked consistently rather than equipment that promised superior performance it could not reliably deliver. The psychological impact of War Daddy 2's performance at Kummersdorf extended far beyond technical reports and engineering specifications. German tank crews who witnessed the testing or read the circulated findings faced a brutal realization that undermined everything they had been taught about German technological superiority. These men had endured the Eastern Front's frozen hell, had fought across North African deserts, had experienced firsthand the mechanical failures that left them stranded and vulnerable while enemy forces closed in. They had been told their suffering served a greater purpose, that German engineering excellence would ultimately prevail, despite temporary setbacks, that the Reich's technical sophistication represented an insurmountable advantage over industrially backward enemies. The Sherman's effortless reliability destroyed this comforting narrative with the cold finality of mathematical proof. American tankers were not struggling with inferior equipment while German crews enjoyed superior machines. The opposite was true and had been true from the beginning. By summer 1943, additional captured Shermans arrived at Kummersdorf from multiple theaters, each vehicle adding to the growing body of evidence about American automotive superiority. British units in Italy lost tanks to German counterattacks. Soviet forces on the Eastern Front abandoned damaged Shermans during retreats that German forces later recovered. Each captured vehicle underwent similar testing protocols, building a comprehensive database that confirmed the initial findings from War Daddy 2. The consistency across variants impressed German engineers who were accustomed to significant quality variations between different manufacturers producing nominally identical German vehicles. American tanks demonstrated remarkable standardization, regardless of which factory produced them or which variant they represented. The M4A1, with its Continental radial engine, performed similarly to the M4A2 with twin General Motors diesels, and the M4A3 with the Ford V8 gasoline engine. Different power plants, different manufacturers, identical reliability in the characteristics that mattered most for sustained combat operations. The diesel-powered M4A2 particularly fascinated German engineers who examined multiple examples captured from Soviet units. The twin GM6046 diesel engine provided performance matching any Sherman variant while consuming substantially less fuel than gasoline engines, a critical advantage as German fuel supplies dwindled throughout 1943 and into 1944. German designers had experimented with diesel tank engines before the war, but abandoned the effort due to manufacturing difficulties and the complexity of reliable fuel injection systems. American industry produced diesel Shermans alongside gasoline variants without disrupting production schedules, demonstrating manufacturing flexibility that German industry never achieved during wartime conditions. The implications extended beyond simple technical comparisons. If American industry could simultaneously produce multiple powertrain variants while maintaining consistent quality and reliability, what did that say about the fundamental industrial capacity gap between the United States and Germany? The numbers became inescapable when examined honestly. American factories would produce 49,324 Sherman tanks during the war, more than all German tank production of all types combined, while also producing astronomical quantities of every other weapon system and maintaining the highest standard of living among all combatant nations. German tank crews began receiving field reports from units that had captured and operated Shermans in combat, adding operational experience to the technical testing data from Kummersdorf. These reports carried particular weight because they came from frontline soldiers describing equipment performance under actual combat conditions rather than controlled testing environments. The findings aligned perfectly with what engineers had documented in their laboratory examinations. German mechanized units desperate for reliable vehicles as their own tank inventory degraded eagerly employed any captured American tanks they could obtain intact. Unlike Soviet T-34 tanks, which Germans modified extensively before use, Shermans entered German service without changes. They did not require modification because they worked correctly as designed, with no fundamental flaws that needed correction before German crews would trust them in combat. The reports from these German units using captured Shermans revealed a painful irony that must have seemed almost deliberately cruel to tank crews who had suffered through years of mechanical failures in their own vehicles. German tankers discovered that American equipment allowed them to focus on tactical considerations and combat effectiveness rather than constantly worrying about reaching the battlefield without breakdown or completing missions before mechanical failure immobilized their vehicles. The psychological liberation of operating truly reliable equipment transformed how these crews approached combat operations. They could plan aggressive maneuvers without calculating mechanical risk factors. They could pursue retreating enemies without fearing their tanks would break down during the chase. they could maintain pressure on defensive positions without needing to conserve their vehicles' remaining mechanical life for the return journey. These tactical advantages, impossible to quantify in technical specifications, but immediately obvious to anyone who had commanded tanks in combat, made the Sherman more valuable than German vehicles with superior armor or firepower that could not reliably reach the fight. The 10th SS Panzer Division captured 12 M4A3 Shermans at Herlisheim in January 1945 during Operation Nordwind, the last major German offensive on the Western Front. These tanks had belonged to the American 43rd Tank Battalion and were captured intact when their crews abandoned them during the German assault. The Germans formed these 12 Shermans into the 13th Company of the 10th SS Panzer Regiment and operated them in combat for the remainder of the war. The choice to organize captured Shermans into a dedicated company rather than distributing them as individual replacements revealed how highly German commanders valued American tank reliability. These vehicles served as reconnaissance elements and mobile reserves, roles that required sustained movement without maintenance, stops, and dependable mechanical performance under varied conditions. German commanders understood what Kummersdorf testing had proven and what frontline experience had confirmed. American tanks could be relied upon to function when needed, while German tanks could not. This dependability, more than firepower or armor protection, determined tactical utility in the final desperate months of the war. A Sherman arriving at the battlefield with an operational 75mm gun was infinitely more valuable than a Panther with superior firepower broken down 20 kilometers behind the lines, awaiting parts that would never arrive. A tank battalion with 80% of its vehicles operational could execute missions that a battalion with 40% operational vehicles simply could not attempt, regardless of how impressive the working vehicle's specifications appeared on paper. German armored units learned this lesson through bitter experience, as their offensive capability collapsed not primarily from enemy action, but from mechanical failure rates that left them unable to concentrate sufficient operational vehicles for effective combat operations. The spring of 1945 brought the final collapse of German resistance as Allied forces converged on Berlin from east and west. Kummersdorf, proving ground, prepared for evacuation as Soviet forces advanced relentlessly toward the capital. Engineers frantically packed testing data and shipped documentation to facilities farther west, hoping to preserve technical intelligence for analysis that would never occur under the Reich, but might prove valuable to whoever controlled Germany after the inevitable defeat. Some of the captured tanks, including at least 2 Shermans, were pressed into improvised service with combat units desperately defending the approaches to Berlin. These vehicles fought alongside German designs in the final chaotic battles, providing one last comparison under actual combat conditions. The Shermans continued operating until destroyed by enemy fire or abandoned when fuel supplies ran out. The German tanks, including Panthers and the few remaining Tigers, broke down from mechanical failures at rates that shocked even experienced crews accustomed to poor reliability. In the final accounting, when ammunition and fuel became scarce and spare parts non-existent, the American tanks kept fighting while German vehicles failed even when their crews desperately needed them to function. The human cost of this reliability gap extended far beyond simple mechanical statistics or operational readiness percentages. Every German tank that broke down during a retreat left its crew vulnerable to capture or death when they could not reach friendly lines on foot. Every mission failure caused by mechanical problems rather than enemy action represented wasted lives of soldiers who died achieving nothing because their equipment failed them. Every tactical defeat that occurred because German units could not concentrate sufficient operational vehicles at the decisive point meant casualties that accomplished no strategic purpose. The Wehrmacht's tank crews, brave men who fought with extraordinary skill and determination, despite facing overwhelming odds, were betrayed not by their courage or competence, but by an industrial system that could not provide them with equipment reliable enough to give their sacrifices as meaning. They died in broken tanks that never reached the battlefield, in disabled vehicles, abandoned during retreats, in hopeless defensive positions where mechanical failures prevented the mobility that might have allowed escape or effective resistance. The bitter irony was that German engineers understood the problems and could articulate solutions, but lacked the industrial capacity to implement changes while simultaneously fighting a losing war on multiple fronts. Reports from Kummersdorf circulated through Wehrmacht technical branches beginning in mid-1943, documenting American automotive superiority with scientific precision and recommending design philosophy changes to improve German tank reliability. These recommendations went largely unimplemented because German industry was already straining beyond capacity to produce existing designs with degrading quality as strategic bombing destroyed key factories and slave labor replaced skilled workers. Introducing major design changes would have temporarily reduced production even further, an unacceptable option when frontline units were screaming for replacement vehicles to offset catastrophic losses. Germany was trapped in a death spiral where poor reliability created losses that demanded increased production that prevented the design improvements that might have improved reliability. The Americans faced no such constraints, safely producing tens of thousands of reliable tanks in factories beyond any enemy's reach while continuously improving designs based on combat feedback. The post-war analysis by American and British intelligence organizations confirmed what German testing at Kummersdorf had revealed years earlier. Systematic examination of destroyed German tanks found mechanical failures as common as combat damage as causes of loss. Final drives broken from stress, transmissions seized from inadequate lubrication or operator error, engines burned out from overheating or oil starvation, all the predictable failures that German crews had learned to expect and American crews rarely experienced. The German obsession with individual vehicle superiority and impressive specifications had blinded them to the critical importance of reliability and maintainability in sustained combat operations. They built tanks that no conscript mechanic could maintain without extensive, specialized training, powered by engines that demanded constant expert attention, supported by a logistics system that collapsed under the accumulated strain of supplying countless unique parts to scattered units across multiple theaters. The lessons learned through testing captured Sherman's directly influenced German tank design thinking in the post-war Bundeswehr of West Germany. When the Federal Republic began developing the Leopard 1 main battle tank in the 1950s, designers consciously emphasized reliability and maintainability over pure performance specifications. They studied American automotive engineering principles and deliberately applied them to military vehicle development, incorporating design philosophies that had made the Sherman successful despite its modest specifications. The resulting Leopard 1 tank became one of the most successful designs of the Cold War era, serving with numerous armies and remaining in production for decades. German engineers had finally learned what American automotive engineers understood from decades of commercial competition. Reliability was not a secondary consideration, subordinate to performance specifications, but rather the foundation upon which all other capabilities depended. A tank that worked consistently was more valuable than a tank that promised superior performance it could not reliably deliver. War Daddy 2, that single Sherman tank captured in Tunisia and tested exhaustively at Kummersdorf, represented far more than enemy equipment brought home for technical examination. It was tangible proof that industrial maturity and sound engineering principles based on practical experience mattered more than theoretical innovation pursued without regard to manufacturing reality or operational requirements. The tank itself was unremarkable in many ways, just one of nearly 50,000 produced, identical to thousands of others serving in American, British, and Soviet units across every theater. What it represented was devastating to German confidence, proof that Germany had already lost the industrial war even as fighting continued, that American productive capacity could not be matched regardless of German technical sophistication or tactical skill, that the outcome was inevitable once the United States fully mobilized its economic potential toward military production. The reliability gap between Sherman and German tanks influenced not just tactical armored warfare, but fundamentally shaped broader understanding of how modern industrial capacity determined military outcomes. Germany entered World War II with technical advantages in many weapons systems, possessing scientific knowledge and engineering expertise that exceeded most opponents. But Germany lacked the industrial depth and manufacturing sophistication to maintain those advantages through sustained mass production, while simultaneously fighting enemies on multiple fronts. The United States entered the war with weapons that were often less technically sophisticated, but possessed industrial capacity to manufacture them in overwhelming quantities, while continuously improving quality and performance based on combat feedback. This industrial approach, perfectly exemplified by Sherman tank design and production, proved far more effective than German technical sophistication applied to limited production runs of complex vehicles that could not be reliably maintained in field conditions. The story of War Daddy 2 and the German tank crews who examined it reveals a profound truth about technological competition and military effectiveness that remains relevant today. Superior specifications mean nothing if equipment cannot reliably perform its mission under actual operating conditions. Impressive technical capabilities provide no advantage if they cannot be produced in sufficient quantities to affect battlefield outcomes. Theoretical performance excellence offers no benefit if it requires maintenance capabilities that do not exist in combat zones or specialized expertise that cannot be provided to frontline units. The Americans understood these principles through decades of commercial automotive competition, where reliability determined market success and manufacturing efficiency determined profitability. They applied this hard-won knowledge to military production and created weapons systems that were good enough in performance, excellent in reliability, and producible in quantities that overwhelmed enemies with superior individual designs but inferior industrial execution. German tank crews who fought in Panthers and Tigers were not defeated by inferior courage, inadequate training, or poor tactical judgment. They were defeated by an industrial system that provided them with equipment impressive in specifications, but inadequate in the reliability required for sustained combat operations. They deserved better from their nation's industrial capacity and engineering expertise. They deserved tanks that would reach the battlefield and complete their missions without mechanical failure. They deserved equipment that rewarded their skill and courage with performance they could depend upon when their lives hung in the balance. Instead, they received vehicles that broke down at crucial moments, that could not be repaired with available resources, that promised capabilities they could not consistently deliver. The Sherman tank, unglamorous and underappreciated by those who focused on armor thickness and gunpowder, gave American and Allied crews the one thing that mattered most: equipment they could trust to function when they needed it. That trust, that confidence in their machines, proved more valuable than any technical specification advantage German tanks might have possessed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.